Hi there. In this lecture, Mikhail Tal is playing against Igors Zdanovs. So this is a 1953 Latvian championship, e4, e5, and Tal plays knight f3, knight c6, and he avoids the royal of pairs. He plays the three knights variation, which goes into a four knights now. And actually, the most common move is bishop b5. And the second most popular move is what Tal played here, d4, which is very, very interesting if you want to get your opponents outside of opening theory. And it is kind of dangerous for black. Bishop b5 has some perks for it. As an example, with bishop b4, white can castle, black can castle, d3, d6. White is first to pin this knight, and there's a big idea of knight d5. So white usually gets an advantage because black has to give up the dark square bishop. So we have a dark square bishop without a counterpart. And in fact, both bishops end up in one of the critical lines, returning back home. So this bishop goes back to c1, not to obstruct, for example, the e4 pawn or the d file. And the other bishop goes to f1. And white does have a nice edge here. So that's why one of the reasons this beaten path is quite lucrative for white. But we see d4, which is interesting in its own right. E takes, and now knight d5. So a very interesting kind of gambit all of a sudden. We see knight b4. If knight takes d5, e takes, knight b4. Bishop c4 is a move here. Definitely not queen takes d4, because then there's knight takes c2 check. And not knight takes d4, because this is just great for black. But bishop c4 is needed here in this line. So this is just a variation. If we get into this variation, bishop c4, and if queen e7 check, you have to inconvenience your king. But it's an interesting game. After queen takes d4, this is actually playable because it looks as though c2's in trouble. White has bishop e3. It gets a little bit kind of razor sharp here. Takes, knight takes, bishop takes g7. It gets a pretty forcing line, but white ends up with a small edge here. In terms of semi-open c-file pressure, for example, here, it's quite pleasant for white. So yeah, there are some interesting lines here with knight takes d5 and knight b4. But we see in this game an immediate knight b4. Bishop e7 is also a beaten path, quite often beaten. Knight takes d4, knight takes d5, e takes. This situation with bishop e2, bishop f6, queen e1 is thought to be about equal. So bishop e7 is actually a rather solid continuation, unadventurous relatively in my view. So knight b4 though was played, and we have knight takes f6, queen takes, a3. So not going into a silly tactical idea. If knight takes, you can see what black does here. Black just plays queen takes d4, and ouch, we've just lost a piece. But no, we have a3 carefully, telling knight to go back, and now bishop g5. So it's an interesting gambit situation we've arrived at here. So white a pawn down. Is there enough compensation? We see bishop d3, bishop c5, both sides castle, and now b4, bishop b6, b5, knight a5, and here e5, and this echoes a kind of potential hook, a tactical hook. Whenever there's advanced pawns, if they're on the dark squares, you can look for those dark square hooks. So f6 and d6 are hook squares, but this one in particular relates to the king. So f6 is kind of highlighted and supported for tactical operations. Now black played d5 here, and technically this is pretty interesting. This could be like a game symbolic of Tal's priorities sometimes is to overwhelm the opponent with complexity, making the position more complex than it should have been. And perhaps this is an interesting example here where queen d2 is played. Now this is a bit of a shaky move in theory. In theory, white should clarify things with e takes d6. And even though, okay, white's pawn down, these pawns are doubled, and there is a certain amount of compensation here. For example, here you can see that there are actually dangers against the king, and it's tricky. If bishop f5, we can go queen f3, and this situation is tricky. It should end up about equal. I know it looks scary as well, actually. This looks like scary stuff, but it should end up as equal. And if you're wondering on knight g5, what about rook takes, then actually black gets punished a bit here after queen h5. This is very precarious for black. For example, this situation with bishop f5, threatening queen h8 checkmate, is kind of scary. And in fact, can you see a tactical shot here that white has to justify things to get an advantage here? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video, this is just a variation of the game. Okay, there would be knight takes f7 here, undermining e6. And yeah, this is unpleasant for black. If queen takes, then knight takes, leaving that bishop pinned as an example. So this is, it shows, well, technically e takes is kind of venomous for black as well. It's technically the best move. Queen d2, it seems as though Tal is letting black get a formidable looking position on the queen side at least. And technically black is better here. We see b takes, there's still going to be this recurring pawn mess now, which looks a little bit frightening. There is the prospect of c4, so Tal has to do something. And he makes use of his advanced pawn here with this next move, which emphasizes f6. I hope you can spot it. Can be a quiet move, clue. So a quiet and strong move in the circumstances to create win probability, queen f4. So Tal is creating win probability, it seems, perhaps not that consciously, through keeping the position pretty unbalanced, complex, and giving, you know, black this extra material to play with and experiment with, for example, the move c4 here. So yeah, I mean, this looks as though it's very lucrative to play c4, and maybe if we base our tactics on things that are apparently lucrative to the opponent, then we're kind of in effect hiding our tactics in plain sight behind things which the opponent's really magnetized towards without too much thinking. So if the opponent's thinking less because they're so lucratized, they're so persuaded, that's to use a more normal word, they're so persuaded to play c4 here that they miss a major tactical opportunity. So c4 was played, and yeah, it's a big problem now. What does white do? But it's magnificently solved here. So for 200 points, what would you play with white in this position? Yeah, it's not just that the pawn is hooking the f6. You know, sometimes this pawn can be in a way promoted to a deadly form pawn, T-H-O-R-N, form pawn, like fawn in the side, which I think was one of the major aspects of neural networks, and the game-changing tactics and strategies of neural networks was to get form pawn. So here, Tal is quite conscious of the potential of a form pawn possibility, and plays, do you want 5 more seconds? I hope you can spot it. Bishop f6. It's got the prospect of promoting this pawn in a way to a form pawn. It's not just hooking f6. It will land on f6 near the opponent's king as a kind of goal-hanging pawn. If instead bishop e2, then h6 and, you know, queen f5, and you can see that actually, ouch, this is going to weaken b3 and horrible things will happen to white. So yeah, it's good that black actually played this way with c4. So bishop f6, and black has got huge problems now. These pieces, although in the Morphy era you'd expect pieces to be asleep, they seem to be awake. But the difference is between Tal, the attacking player, and Morphy. Perhaps here in this example, they're awake, but they're kind of irrelevantly awake. So in most of Paul Morphy's games, the opponent's pieces were asleep, but here it's kind of irrelevantly awake. They're away from the king, so they might as well be asleep, basically. These pieces might as well be asleep. There's huge pressure building up on g7. How is this bishop relevant to g7? So yeah, kind of, yeah, asleep in a way. So irrelevant spectators there. So we have bishop d8 trying to contest things, but it's too late. If c takes, by the way, queen g5 is ouch town after queen h6, and g7 is landing a mate. You know, this only delays. So bishop d8. If g takes, by the way, let's look at g takes. E takes with the form pawn, and with the prospect now of queen g5, queen g7. If king h8, then queen h6, and we're threatening queen g7 and queen takes h7 mate. So, you know, rook g8, queen takes h7. So bishop d8 was tried, but now, unfortunately, there's a crushing tactical blow here. Can you spot what that is for 100 points? Okay, bishop takes h7 check. Yeah, there's a nasty fork here. And it looks completely unpalatable to play king h8. In case you're wondering about king h8, what is the best way to play this for white? In fact, let me test you. So if I give you 5 seconds here, what would you play? There's a very, very strong move, which is pretty non-controversial actually, which is the way to go. So 5 seconds to pause the video. White to play for 100 points. The best way, the most clear cut, is actually bishop takes d8. And look, we're actually hitting a5 as well. And also you'll note that this will be an unprotected piece sometimes, looking at h8 and d8. So this is a great move. Bishop takes d8. If rook takes, knight g5 is actually even stronger than queen h4. Is actually the way to go, in fact, with a hit on e6 and f7. And here, if queen c6, now we can use queen h4 with huge, gigantic threats. If queen h6, then we can actually just win the queen. Ouch. But otherwise, it's a really crushing position. So we're threatening knight takes f7 mating. But also, if, for example, queen d7, then we can crush with bishop f5 check at the very minimum, winning the queen. So yeah, it's all pretty crushing after bishop takes d8. This is a clear-cut way to go here. If you thought queen h4, black can actually take out f6, hitting the queen. This is slightly annoying. It turns out even here, white can play queen h5 with advantage, though. But it's just not as clear cut. You can see that there are defensive resources coming in to help black live another day. But white still has an advantage even here. So the most clear cut though is bishop takes d8. Pretty non-controversial and absolutely winning. Okay. So we have king takes h7, knight g5 check, just going into this fork. So winning the queen now. And now queen g5, so that bishop doesn't have to be lost for nothing. It's lost for the opponent's bishop. After rook takes, queen e5, and that's the end of the game here. End of the game. Black resigned. So if knight c6, the pain doesn't end. You know, queen d6, and where is the knight going? If bishop b7, this is underminable now. For example, here, rook d8, queen c5, keeping a view on c6 and b7, and then crunch, rook takes b7 is winning material. So there's a further material loss implication here after queen e5. It's pretty unfortunate, the position. So anyway, it's only, if you think about it, it's 2 rooks each, but the queen is against knight and bishop, so you should expect really white to be in the driving seat here. So yeah, a crushing game. It shows, give Tal some advanced pawns and look at what squares they're hooking into. Are they related to the king? Can we create a form pawn? I think there is a certain amount of takeaway points here. the opponent's pieces are really going to be on the back row, but at least make them irrelevant. Get them occupied in something else. In computer security, this is called if you give the opponent too much complexity, it's like a kind of denial of service. They're thinking so much about the complexity, they miss out the major issues. It makes them easy to slip up because their resources are overloaded, thinking about their opportunities on the other side of the board. But yeah, the focus is on the king side here. It's in dramatic focus. It was one of the perks of the advanced e5 pawn from the outset of this game. So an interesting attacking game. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much. Hi there. Thanks for getting to the end of the YouTube video. If you would like to see other Mikhail Tal games, I actually have an amazing course for Mikhail Tal, which is currently at 4.9 with over 400 students. You can check this out from the Kingscrusher TV page. So Chess Strategy and Tactics, Mikhail Tal's amazing games. You can check out some free preview videos as well here. If you do expand all sections, you can see the preview links to get some free previews. So I hope you do check out this course index and the free previews. So I really had a thrilling time actually checking out Mikhail Tal's games. So yeah, the YouTube video here you saw was just a sample from this course. I hope you check it out. Okay, thanks so much. Oh, by the way, comments, questions, likes, shares, all appreciated. And if you did get to this part of the video, please do leave some sort of comment like Tal fan. Okay, thanks again.